Welcome to Essentials for Adoption Attuned Parenting, a podcast exploring how parents can best relate and connect to their adopted child. If you have adopted, or even if you are thinking about adopting, this is the show for you. Discover tips and tools for adoption attuned parenting. This is the podcast for building a strong foundation for your adoptive family. And now, from growing intentional families together, here are your hosts, coaches, and adoptive parents, Susan David and Gayle Swift.
Hi, this is Susan from San Diego. Welcome to the Essentials for Adoption Attuned Parenting. I am joined by my co-host, adoption coach, author, and adoptee activist, and my colleague at Growing Intentional Families Together, Gayle Swift. Good morning, Gayle.
Good morning, Susan. Thanks for the intro. I'm excited about joining you on the podcast today, and especially excited about today's guest. She and I have been collaborating for several years via the magic of social media. Lynn was instrumental in helping Sally and I interview adult adoptees for our book. We kind of consider the midwife to our book.
So joining us today, as you've mentioned, Gayle, is Lynn Grubb. Lynn offers a variety of perspectives. She's an adoptee, a kinship adoptive parent, and she's the editor of the Adoptee Survival Guide. Adoptees share their wisdom and tools. Now, a while back, maybe a few months ago, our listeners may have joined us for an interview with Lynn. And during that interview, we invited her back to talk about an ongoing project that she's into called Adoption Genealogy.
Let me tell you a little bit about Lynn first, Susan. She was born in Chicago in the middle of the baby scoop era. Lynn grew up wondering where she came from and why she was given up for adoption. Lynn writes from the perspective of many hats, as you mentioned: adult adoptee, kinship adoptive parent, step parent, biological parent, and child advocate. When not writing, you can find her at any live concert. She currently serves as president of the Adoptee Rights Coalition, which advocates for adopted people to receive equal access to their original birth certificates. Such an important issue, Lynn. At the age of 40, Lynn embarked on a search for her roots, had a reunion with her maternal family. 14 years later, she found her birth father, thanks to genetic genealogy. Lynn is currently working on a memoir to be published in 2021. Lynn also serves as, quote, the adopted genealogist, unquote, on Facebook, where she uses her expertise to help other adoptees find their family. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you. Super excited to talk with you ladies again today. Thanks for inviting me back.
You're welcome. I'm glad to have you join us.
Absolutely. And so, Lynn, in a nod to National Adoption Month that comes up in November, we thought we'd focus today on this topic of genetic genealogy. Our purpose for this interview is to encourage adoptive parents to have a more expansive view of adoption, especially that of adult adoptees. Accessing information is part of the adoption process. Genetic genealogy can be a useful tool for this purpose. So we're eager to learn more from you, Lynn.
So Lynn, Gayle texted me early this morning, since I'm on Pacific time and she's on Eastern time. And she told me that genealogy is the second most popular hobby in the United States. So surpassed only by gardening, which I like to garden. So I was kind of surprised by that. Yet, how do you find adoptees? Is this something that they are pursuing? Do you see that it's a necessary avenue to access their roots? And before we even start, can you explain what genetic genealogy is? Because all of a sudden I'm in Ancestry.com, right? So can you explain it to me what it is?
Yes, it's combining DNA testing with traditional genealogy to infer a genetic relationship.
Very economically said.
Yeah, so old school genealogy is, based on records. Okay. Simplified version. Genetic genealogy is you start with taking an autosomal DNA test, whether it be at Ancestry, 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and you use the information in your DNA to determine relationships.
So, Lynn, I suspect most adoptive parents might be a bit wary of accessing genetic genealogy while their children are young. What would you say to them to alleviate their fears so that they can see it as a resource and not a threat? And also that it isn't a one-size-fits-all endeavor.
Well, I would definitely understand why people would be concerned, because there are lots of ethical considerations when it comes to testing. Just to point out, I've done a DNA video that's at my blog called Should I Test My DNA? And it's a lot of things to consider, such as how do you feel about law enforcement being able to access your DNA? That's a big one. I always recommend adoptees test at Ancestry first. Ancestry is a private company. They don't allow law enforcement into their database. Mm-hmm. So also for the use of determining parentage, Ancestry is your best bet because all of the trees are there and you need trees in order to determine parentage. So in other words, if you test your DNA, but there's no tree building going on, unless you get a very, very close match to a parent or a sibling, you're not going to understand how you're related to any of these people in the database.
And also in some of our previous conversations, Lynn, you said something about you can be a little bit anonymous.
Yes.
Which I think.
So, yeah, I mean, if you tested Ancestry or 23andMe, you can create a profile name that does not identify you. Like the one that comes to mind is this guy who's a match to me has one called The Attorney Next Door. You know, we don't know if he's really an attorney, but that's his profile name. And if you don't attach a tree, you're careful with what you say to your matches when they respond to you, you can remain anonymous. There's obviously no guarantee, but that's your best bet to remain anonymous from your matches. Now, the caveat to that is if you get a half sibling match, someone's going to know that you're their half sibling, but they won't necessarily know your identity unless you disclose that to them.
Well, and also in some of our other previous conversations, Lynn, you said something about you can test not necessarily with an interest in identifying who your biological parents are, but in pursuit of your ethnicity.
Correct. Yes, there is a way to opt out of DNA matching and only access your ethnicity report, which I want to say here that those change depending on how many testers and depending on which company you test with. So, for example, in 23andMe, they pointed me to the fact that I was Peruvian long before the other databases. So 23andMe is my favorite ethnicity report. Also, a bonus to adoptees is that you get some medical information. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not necessarily the same as going to your doctor, but it can tell you if you have a genetic propensity toward a certain disease. It's not a perfect predictor. Just because you might have a propensity toward a certain cancer doesn't mean you're going to get it. And it should not be used the same way as you would use medical testing with your doctor. But 23andMe offers both of those things, in my opinion, a better ethnicity breakdown and the medical genetic things. And some of it is fun. I go more into it in the video that I have posted at my blog. Should I test my DNA? I give, examples from my own DNA, things like whether you like the taste of cilantro or what time of day you wake up in the morning. Just funny little, things that they can discover from your DNA. Is it 100% accurate? No. But usually they can detect, do you have brown hair? Do you have brown eyes? It detected that I had curly hair. Little things like that. 23andMe gives you a lot more bang for your buck, in my opinion. However, the downside of 23andMe is the lack of the trees. You really need the trees. So if any adoptee is really looking for family, they should test it both.
Interesting. So you're saying that you have the genetics without the tree doesn't really help you much. So you have to be working on the DNA, do the DNA testing, like with 23andMe, and then roll on over to, let's say, something like Ancestry.com to do the trees.
Well, more people will have trees at Ancestry because that's kind of their thing. They do tree building. Right. 23andMe is not geared toward tree building. However, if you can identify your match, you can create your own tree, which is what I had to do. So you take your closest match, and if you can identify who they are, you can build their family tree yourself and start making connections between you, make inferences between how you're related to that DNA match.
And that's on 23andMe?
Yeah, that's anywhere really. MyHeritage, GEDmatch, any of the testing companies that aren't specializing in tree building. But for adoptees, because we don't know, a lot of times we don't know a parent, that rules us out of genealogy altogether. So it's kind of a catch-22. You really need the trees. So you need other people's trees to identify your common ancestors in order to solve the mystery of your parent.
So Lynn, last night, one of the comments you made is it should always be adoptee driven, the decision to test. Is that correct? And can you?
I mean, that's my opinion, because, sometimes you want to ask yourself, what is the motivation and what is the goal? Is the goal to have a reunion, or is the goal just to learn your ethnicity? And because DNA gives so much information, and kids, under 18, for example, may not have the developmental capacity to understand and process everything that's coming at them. It happens so fast when you test. I think it's, you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. When someone's under 18, is the under 18 child coming to you and saying, I've always wanted to know my ethnicity, or I want to know who my father is, or I want to know where my people come from, I want to know something about my medical history, whatever they're asking, I think adoptive parents can help the child. It's a tough balance because some adoptees won't want their adoptive parents involved in this. Mm-hmm. And because we lacked control so early in our life, it's very tough to, we don't necessarily want our adoptive parents to be in charge of it. But at the same time, we need that guidance and the support. We need the support to manage it because it's such a big deal. So I would not recommend anyone just willy-nilly test without support in place.
Two things come to mind. One is that the adoptive parents need to truly accept and embrace the fact that the kids want this information.
Yes, most do. I would say I've met some that don't. I mean, I was the kid that wanted to know from the very beginning. So it's hard for me to project into another adoptee's head who was like, oh, I don't care about that, So for me, I mean, I would have been that kid who would have nagged my parents. And if they wouldn't have DNA tested for me, I would have just bought a DNA test at my friend's house and done it myself. I mean, that's the kind of kid I was.
And it's interesting, as my own children have reunited with their biological families, to see how it wasn't necessarily an immediate thing. There can be pauses in the degree of connection that they were in charge. I wasn't driving that. I was just saying, I'm fine with that, so that they could not feel like they had to baby me. That's not their responsibility anyway. But
that's a great point. That's a really great point, because I have been writing in my memoir that how my mom reacted to my reunion became too much for me. I could barely deal with my own emotions, and hers was just too much. I just couldn't at that time. So I think we have to be careful on what the motivation is, what the goal is, take baby steps. If you only want to know ethnicity, don't do DNA matching right away.
How can you know ethnicity without doing DNA matching? I'm a little confused there.
I have allowed DNA matching. So it's my understanding that you can make your settings so that you don't DNA match with anybody, but you'll still get your ethnicity report. That is my understanding. Uh-huh. I haven't tried it myself because every kit that I manage allows DNA matching. But I've been told that both 23andMe and Ancestry give you the opportunity to opt out of the DNA matching. So that means no one else in the database can see you. Okay. And that is a really good consideration for anyone under 18 who's not ready, who says, I have these questions, but I don't necessarily want to meet my birth parents. I do want to recommend a documentary I saw last week called Found on Netflix. It's 3 Korean adoptees. 2 of them were under 18 and one was right at graduation age. And they all tested at 23andMe and matched each other. And they created their own support network on Zoom or, Google Meets. And they all lived in different cities and they were all Korean adoptees. And then they eventually, all their families traveled back to Korea together. So I wanted to recommend that because it's a really good window into how the teenagers felt. I thought it was really done so well. They talked about, one of them didn't really want to find birth parents. The other 2 did. It was just a really great example of how it's 2 steps forward, a step back, a step forward, a step back, all the fears, all those abandonment issues that you will come up when you're thinking about all of these things. And so it's a big step. I don't want to make it sound like DNA testing is the greatest thing ever, which in my mind it is because of my own personal situation, being an older person that didn't know my parentage. But for the younger generation, it's just like social media. You have to be careful. You can use it for good. You can use it for bad.
Yeah.
That's true.
As an adoptive parent, to me, this is just another tool in my toolkit of keeping my mind open and helping. It's possible to help my own children find their roots, right? So why wouldn't I want to have this in my toolkit is kind of where I'm at. Why wouldn't I? Or it might be something I would potentially help them use. Or if they're adults and that they go for it, to me, I just think, wow, this is so incredible, right? To have this tool.
It's interesting to me that a lot of people find it difficult to understand why adoptees need really access to their biological ancestry, because as we discussed earlier in our conversation, genealogy is the second most popular hobby in the country. An adoption decree can't change human nature. That's human nature at work. And to say you're not allowed to have access to that information contravenes human nature. It's a human need.
Yes, and when you grow up without the genetic mirroring, it's hard. You don't feel attached to the earth. Your roots aren't solid because you can't look around you and see yourself reflected back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did some work when my mom passed about 3 years ago. I felt inclined to find out about that side of the family, and I felt like I had control of the situation. That's what I'm thinking. Is like, do you get on this train and it's a fast-speeding locomotive, or do you feel like you can kind of control it?
That's a great question. Now, I've helped adoptees find their birth parents, and they came to me later after kind of making a mess of their situation. And I'll give you an example. They messaged their closest matches. They told their whole story. I'm adopted. There's somebody in your family who I'm related to, and that scares people away.
Yeah.
So I would say you really want to get an experienced genealogist or search angel who respects your boundaries and won't contact people without your permission, can help guide you through the process of what to say and what not to say, and to document the information that you're looking at before somebody ghosts you. That happens sometimes. Mm-hmm. So yes, you can control it if you have the knowledge and the information and you're careful and you do your research. If you just willy-nilly test and start telling your story to everybody, you're going to lose control really, really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and people can shut you down and shut you out.
Yes, but, with the anonymity potential, and if you don't contact any of your matches and you just quietly do your research, which is what I recommend to people, eventually you're going to want to talk to your matches, but not until you have gathered all the information. If you do it carefully and think it through before you do it, and maybe even get an adoption competent therapist to walk through it with you when the emotions come up, I think that's really doing it carefully. We have to take it seriously. It's not, although it seems like, oh, it's so easy. You just spit in a tube and mail it back to the company. There's so many other considerations that you want to really look at and have talked through before you embark on DNA testing.
I think one of the revelations I had was the idea that you could help your younger children with genetic genealogy access their ethnicity, which I think could be very helpful when you're growing up, but that usurping their right to control whether or not they wanted access or connection to their biological roots until they were old enough to make that decision for themselves intelligently and well prepared, that it can be two distinct steps.
Yeah, I think, every adoptee is different. Every one of us feels differently about their roots. Some people don't have as many questions until they're older. Some never want to know. Mm-hmm. And for me, ethnicity was a big deal because I knew that I was different than my family. But other adoptees who may look more like their parents may not be thinking about that. I just was, because people would come up to me and say, "Where are you from?" Often enough that I was like, they must think I look different. So yeah, it really depends on the adoptee. And I think it's important, yes, for parents not to just take it on as their personal project and start doing all of this work without discussing it with the adoptee. Now, I have tested my own daughter, and she's adopted. And I recently spoke to her about this in preparation for this podcast and just asked her how she felt about the DNA testing. She really said, other than she's hoping to test with her half sibling or match with her half siblings in the future, she's not really interested. She doesn't really care about it.
Yeah. And then
knows her roots. So
that's
it
my
can be
daughter
different.
hearing. Sorry about that. Yeah. Wait, no, so that could change though, Lynn. Okay. We're going to have dog time here. I apologize. So what you're saying is, for her right now, she's not interested, but it may change and you'll be open to that.
Well, she already knows her birth family. We're part of her birth family.
Right. I remember you telling us that on your.
Yeah, she already knows everything. So there's no big secret. There's no, will she maybe decide she's interested in genealogy at some point? Yeah, possibly. But she has all the answers at her fingertips right now.
So she's not struggling with the information hole that most of the adoptees are.
No, she's had the information since birth. Yeah, we've been talking to her about it. I've journaled her early story for her. She has the journal. She can read it anytime. She has pictures of her birth mother giving birth to her. She was a C-section baby, so she has pictures of her coming out of the womb. And she's got everything, really. The only thing she doesn't have is a relationship with her birth mother. So that will be something that she will likely explore in the future.
Let's see, do we talk about the best reason or the most common purpose? When I hear the words the best reason, it presumes that I'm going to know as an adoptive parent, so I encourage our listeners, adoptive parents, not to be putting that on, like, we've got to do this or this is important for us. So I'm going to say it a different way. What would be the most common purpose that motivates an adoptive parent to pursue genetic genealogy on behalf of their children? Would this be something I would want to think about early on?
I would say to find out who the child's father is probably the most common reason. I've talked to adoptive parents who don't have any information on the biological father. Mm-hmm. And, in my own case, there was none, and there wasn't really much in the file either that the adoption agency kept. Sometimes the adoption agency will have the name in the file, but, those are confidential. So, but yeah, that I would say accessing the name of the biological father. And again, each of these different, some may not care about that, but, at some point kids will start asking, who are my biological parents?
Yeah. An adult adoptee that I know who always espoused disinterest in his biological father was delighted when the biological father found him, and that switched his viewpoint, or at least his public viewpoint, once he was found. He was actually very delighted to have that reconnection.
Yeah, because it's less rejection. You're not risking rejection when someone finds you as much,
Yeah.
We often talk about, at Growing Intentional Families Together, we often talk about cultural myths that are perpetrated on adoptive parents or adoptive families, adoptees in particular. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think the genetic genealogy brings up for me, this idea that people are going to say, hey, aren't you worried about what you'll find? They don't even go to that other layer that says, I need to know about myself, right? And whatever I find. And it's such an odd question to me, I think, because we focus at the awareness on myths, right? So I think all of this intentional thinking, like when to do it, and are you ready, and are you prepared with a therapist to talk through some of the stuff that might come up, it will just help you to overcome this idea that, oh my Lord, what am I going to find? It's like, you know what I'm saying?
Yes, I think it's probably similar to what adoptees get. At least I did when I was searching, or I share my story with people. I get a lot of people saying, well, what do your adoptive parents think about that? Mm-hmm. So they get focused on the wrong thing. Some people do not like change. And yeah, when you DNA test, you are opening Pandora's box in a way, but I like to think of it as you can carefully open it, or you can fling it open. Right? It's your choice. If you want to bring drama into your life, then do it carelessly. But if you want to help support your child get their answers met, then you can work with them with testing, or you can give it to a third party if your child feels unsure. Because, adoptees don't want to have to manage their parents' emotions about all the new findings. They have enough to manage on their own.
Yeah.
Absolutely 100% true.
That goes under the heading of handle your stuff, handle your own stuff. Don't put it on your kid, right?
Do the work, right?
Yeah, do the work. That's right. This is so fascinating because I do a little bit of that genealogy research, but it takes some devotion to it, I found. I'm going to ask you, I wonder if Ancestry.com has any tutorials on this, because I've done a few of their tutorials. I think this would be an excellent place where they could help people out trying to figure this whole thing out.
Specifically on adoptions, Susan?
Yeah, no. Ancestry has these tutorials on how to search for your family, your roots, and what do you do first. And for instance, one tutorial that I looked at talked about this filling in your tree really fast, right? You fill in your tree. The thing is, then you don't know the story behind it. So they encourage you to take your time. And it's not about filling the tree as it is to learn about what the documents say, not just how to read it. Okay, you can read the document, but what it might mean. For instance, my family comes from West Virginia. They're coal miners, right? And so when you see that my grandfather had Social Security and he's 43 years old, what's going on there? Disability, right? He hurt his arm in a mine, which I found that out later. But the point I'm getting at is that I think that this would be an area for you to host, Lynn, your own program and your own tutorial in Ancestry.com. I can't speak to the other services. That's all.
Thank you.
I think it'd be fascinating.
Right? He's going to give you a new career.
Yeah. Well, right. I am in genealogy school, so this is what I hope to be doing in the future more. But there was something I wanted to say. Oh, there are tutorials through Ancestry by the Barefoot Genealogist. Her name's Krista Cowan. I watch her videos sometimes. She does them. She works for Ancestry, and you can find her on YouTube, Krista Cowan.
Yeah.
And there's so many other really great ones that I follow.
Lynn, do we look for her as the Barefoot Genealogist or as Krista Cowan, or both?
You could probably do both. I think she goes by both. I think the Barefoot Genealogist might be her blog name.
Okay.
But she works for Ancestry and does a load of YouTube. And if you just type the words genetic genealogy into YouTube, you're going to come up with all sorts of videos.
Okay.
A lot of genetic genealogists that I follow, that's their main thing is education, because there is a learning curve on understanding how to use the trees and the DNA in order to come up with an answer that you're seeking. So with, for example, a birth parent, you have to do lots of steps. So it's definitely a learning process. Just because you test your DNA doesn't mean it's going to spit out a magic answer. There's a lot of work involved.
So I'm sure our viewers will want lots of information on this, Lynn. Where can they find you online?
I am the Adopted Genealogist at Instagram and Facebook. I will eventually have a website by that name, but you can find me now at my blog, No Apologies for Being Me. And if you click into DNA testing, that video, Should I Test My DNA? There's a link. I recently linked it. You probably won't be able to find it on YouTube, so you'll want to go through my blog. It's a 30-minute talk on all the reasons to test and not to test that you want to think through before you embark. So I talk about law enforcement and privacy and things that we weren't really able to cover in this podcast. It just gives you a wider, more things to think about, and I'll be happy to send that to you.
Thank you, Lynn. We appreciate that very much.
And I'll put it in the show notes so our listeners can have that information.
Great.
Yeah.
Lynn, thanks so much for sharing so honestly and generously. Your insights certainly provide an invaluable resource to adoptive parents and prospective adoptive parents, as well as their children, who, after all, are our priority for us at Growing Intentional Families together and within our own families, for sure.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
So Listeners, please remember that these are our observations as coaches and adopted parents. We know that each person and family and adoptee are unique and their experiences may be different from ours.
But our hope is that you'll consider adoption attunement practices as a guide for parenting your adopted family. And I want to say that thank you, Lynn, for joining us. And, this is just one area that allows our families to move away from what adoption's been in the past, right? So intentional, thought out, and reflective of an adoptee's desire to know more.
Susan and I invite you to share your experiences with us, listeners. So go to the Growing Intentional Families Together Facebook page or the Growing Intentional Families Together website to leave your comments.
And we'll put Lynn's information in there, Gayle. We'll
Excellent.
Put it in okay. Tell us what's going on in your family and let's talk about it. We'd also like to let you know that Growing Intentional Families Together coaches are available to present workshops online mostly.
Not in person lately.
No.
So yes, please contact us at giftfamilyservices.com to explore this possibility.
That brings us to a close for today. Again, a thank you to our special guest, Lynn Grubb, for joining us. And Lynn, Gayle and I would be honored to have you back again to discuss anything. Well, I like to say all things adoption. We like to talk about other things too. But anyways, come on back.
I look forward to that.
All right, good. I'm Susan from beautiful and always sunny San Diego. And today we have rain. So that's unusual for us.
Ditto, I'm Gayle from an equally sunny place, and we also are having rain today, even though it's the middle of the dry season. So remember, adoption matters. Talk about it, read about it, and learn about it. Until next time, we say goodbye.
Thank you for listening to Essentials for Adoption Attuned Parenting. If you liked the program, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help us spread the message about building strong and connected adoptive families. If you'd like more information about growing intentional families together and their adoption coaches, as well as to sign up for your free coaching consultation, visit giftfamilyservices.com. We have enjoyed being with you and invite you to join us again next time for another Essentials for Adoption Attuned Parenting.